Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Natural Horror November, where I'm hijacking Anatomy of Fear to talk about my favorite genre of horror. If you were expecting the episode on Discovery Horror, well, that was the plan. But I've decided to make a few changes to that episode, and you will not want to miss it. So while I have the little gremlins working on that in the background, I'm jumping right into disaster horror. Boy, what a great topic this is. For years I've been wanting this genre to actually be a thing, because it combines two of my favorite genres into one. I will never pass up an opportunity to watch a disaster movie even if I know it's going to be terrible. I am the proud owner of one DVD titled Avalanche Sharks, which was a must-buy from the bargain bin of my local Big Lots, and nobody was around to talk me out of it. So it happened. It is mine now. We all love disaster movies though, right? But why? Disaster movies are popular in times when we're the most confused and uncertain about the future. This includes the disillusioned 70s, as well as the post-Soviet 90s, and post-9/11 gave us a spate of them as well. And as I'm sure you're putting together right now, I don't think there's been a more confusing time than right now, so expect to see more of them in the next few years. Confusion and chaos are interesting topics to explore during times of peace, but during times of strife, they almost seem to border on therapy. When the world is just too big and too complicated, we tend to crave escapism. Disaster movies can offer that, if it's a certain kind of uplifting tale of heroism that has a nice, happy ending. But disaster movies can also be terrifying, and they have the potential to go to some very dark places. Some of them offer no hope for a future at all. You'll soon see what I mean as I go through some of these. But before we get to any of that, I have to give a couple shout outs to two podcasts, which have got to be the only other podcast that I know of that have ever talked about this topic. The first is S.A. Bradley's Hellbent for Horror. I have to not only give him major props for highlighting disaster horror and the fantastic job he does, but I credit him with partially inspiring me to include it in this series on natural horror. He believes, as I do, that some disaster movies are horror movies in disguise. The other podcast is Disaster Girls. If you're a fan of disaster movies in general, Disaster Girls is a podcast of two friends that talk about all kinds of disaster movies, though they seem to delight the most in the trashiest among them, and I could not agree more. Their podcast is so much fun to listen to, I haven't actually listened to an episode I didn't like. Seriously, go check out both of those podcasts. They don't know me, and I'm certainly not getting paid. I just really dig them, and I think you will too. Some of what I cover here is bound to overlap with these podcasts, mostly Hellbent for Horror, since his is specifically about horror, and I hope Mr. Bradley interprets this episode as merely a common interest featuring some shared ideas and not as an attempt to copy him. Okay, well, with that said, let's get started. I'm not going to focus on films that by some definition happen to be a disaster if it looks and feels like another kind of movie. For example, Day of the Animals is, I guess, a disaster movie from a certain point of view. The ozone layer in that movie is depleted, and this somehow leads to all the animals and people above a certain elevation to behave erratically and aggressively. Though technically a disaster movie, the main feature of that movie is the animals. I've already talked about this kind of movie. Bug is a movie that opens with an earthquake that releases fire-starting cockroaches from deep within the earth. The Birds is often called a disaster film as well. Disaster movie legend Irwin Allen also made The Swarm, a movie about a swarm of killer bees, and although it's not very good, it is also technically a disaster film. And then there was Crawl, my favorite film of last year, which I talked about in our end of the year episode. Indeed, there are a lot of horror films that are natural horror first and disaster second. They count for sure, but that's not what I want to focus on in this episode. There's a special kind of horror film that is almost exclusively a disaster film, and there are enough of them, and a wide range of them, that I really want to show them the love they deserve. When I look at the pantheon of disaster horror films, I see 4 categories, each with their own particular flavor. Well, 5, I guess, if you want to count the animal attack movies, but like I said, I won't be covering them in this episode because this episode is already going to be long enough. These 4 categories all put the powerful forces of nature front and center in our psyche in such a visceral and unshakable way. At no point during any of these films do you forget that nature is making this happen. So let's start with the first category, and that is acts of God. This is the easiest to wrap your head around because it's what most people think of when they think of disaster movies. Earthquakes, volcanoes, storms, floods, tsunamis, you get the idea. Like I said, my number one film of last year featured a girl and her father trying to keep from being alligator food in the middle of a hurricane. But I see this as very clearly a gator movie first and foremost, and it just happens to take place in a hurricane. Sure, the storm is pretty scary, the special effects are out of this world, and it really does amplify the tension. But clearly, everyone came to the theaters to see the gator. So while it still counts as a disaster movie, I think the fear that is evoked by the films I want to look at could only be captured in a disaster movie. Whenever a horror film centers around an act of God, more than anything, the feeling is dread. The scary thing about acts of God is that they happen. And depending on where you live, chances are they have happened. And even though we in 2020 like to think we have such a good handle on things, that doesn't mean that disaster response will always be great. It also doesn't mean that there aren't natural disasters that we probably won't even be able to do anything about. There are even a few natural disasters, some of which you may not even be familiar with, that will kill many before anyone even has a clue what's going on. There is one such act of God that I'm going to take a minute to tell you about because it's just bonkers, and you won't be able to sleep tonight if you think too much about it. In 1986, a cloud of gas formed above Lake Nyos in Cameroon, and it drifted down into a neighboring village in the middle of the night and killed everyone that lived there. The cloud was said to have traveled up to 25 kilometers at a speed between 25 to 50 miles per hour, killing everyone and everything in its path. 1,700 lives perished altogether. Just like that. An invisible, odorless cloud that killed everyone that it touched. Sounds pretty terrifying, right? Well, the phenomenon is known as a limnic eruption, which is when a gas that is dissolved in a body of water suddenly releases from the water. The cloud was CO2, carbon dioxide, and it forms when a stratified accumulation of dissolved CO2 in the bottom of the lake becomes dislodged, so to speak, and rises to the surface all at once. Think about a can of soda. When you open it, bubbles form, and all the dissolved CO2 rises to the surface and escapes the can. When this happens, something has to change to make the CO2 want to leave the water. In the case of the soda can, it's the change in pressure. In the case of Lake Nyos, well, the debate is still going. There is evidence that Lake Michigan has a high concentration of dissolved CO2, but a limnic eruption there seems presently unlikely. But who knows? There could be some lake somewhere waiting to erupt with gases, and the next limnic eruption could be near a far bigger population center. Could you imagine turning on the news to find out that tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people just dropped dead just like that? I'm not saying it's likely, but just that if it were to happen, it would be nothing short of traumatic. We humans like to think we know the planet so well, or so they say, and they would be mostly right. But right now, is anyone looking for this little-known disaster? Limnic eruptions have to have a CO2 source, which is usually a volcano. But if scientists actually studied every lake that sits atop a volcano, whether it's active or dormant, well, I'll tell you something that may freak you out a little bit. There's actually kind of a shortage of volcanologists at the moment. Back in 2014, for example, Japan realized after the eruption of Mount Ontake that they really need more volcanologists. Volcanologists closely monitor active volcanoes, but they focus on the ones that are in densely populated areas, and that makes sense. But nevertheless, while we're talking about it, volcanoes, statistically speaking, are not that deadly. They don't tend to go off very often, and because we've gotten pretty good at being able to detect with seismograms how likely a volcano is to go off, we tend to see it coming. Much like many cities sitting next to a volcano, Seattle has a detailed disaster management plan in the event that Mount Rainier erupts, a volcano that is on most top 10 lists of volcanoes most likely to erupt in our lifetimes. That's not to say that it can't be scary when it happens, and while it would surely make for a great horror film, most volcano movies are either action-adventure or they have some fantasy element to them. This does make me a little sad, but there's still time for volcano horror, so let's see it, filmmakers. Okay, well, I could probably spend all day talking about horror films that could be made about disasters. I just really wanted to convey the sense that disaster horror is such a young genre. Disaster films are usually more fun than anything else. Even the more serious ones that feature a lot of drama still excite us whenever the subject of the film's title rears its ugly head. It takes a certain type of film that is willing to go dark enough and present the disaster to us as bleak and as glib as possible, and that's when it starts to look like a horror film. One of the best examples of this cynical nightmare of a film is the Charlton Heston picture Earthquake.
Fear and panic. Heroism and cowardice. Sadism and self-sacrifice. Hysteria and mass emotion that will surround and engulf you completely and make you feel you are there.
Hey, you're all gonna have to help yourselves. Help me!
This film came out during the peak of disaster movies in 1974, right along with The Towering Inferno and the first Airport sequel. 1974 was also a zenith for confusion and disillusionment in this country. It was a year after the Yom Kippur War and the oil crisis, and it was the year that Nixon ultimately resigned. Not to be outdone, though, were countless actual disasters as well. Several plane crashes occurred that year, such as Turkish Airlines Flight 981 that crashed near Paris, killing over 300 people, and TWA Flight 841 crashing into the Ionian Sea after leaving Athens when a bomb on board exploded. The year also saw the largest super outbreak of tornadoes in recorded history, and Darwin, Australia was almost completely destroyed by a cyclone. Perhaps that's a bit of cherry picking. Disasters do happen all the time, and perhaps 1974 wasn't unique. But it's just to say that the disaster craze didn't just spring up out of nowhere. If it feels like ugliness and bad behavior is rampant throughout the film Earthquake, well, that's because it's accurately depicting the mood of the country. The movie opens with Charlton Heston's engineer character fighting with his wife, who minutes later attempts to kill herself for presumably the umpteenth time. It's actually a very good metaphor for the state of society at that time, and it was just as relevant then as it is today. Other fighting and nastiness is repeated throughout the movie. In one of the film's infamous sequences, while the main earthquake is underway, several people rush into an elevator to escape the collapsing structure. One of the men actually pulls a woman out of the elevator so he can fit inside. This little act actually changes the way we feel about what happens next. The elevator cables snap, and the whole group plummets to their bloody death. This is a key scene, too, or it would have been anyway. Had they managed to do what they'd actually intended, the world might actually be more willing to call this a horror movie. They'd originally planned to have stunt actors fall through the ceiling of the elevator and smashing into the floor, splattering blood all over the walls. Yes, this scene was supposed to be an actual bloodbath. What we got instead was a cheesy 3-second animation of blood splattering. I mean, the sentiment is still there. It's still horrifying, but it's too bad. Sometimes technical problems inadvertently make a movie better, like it did for Jaws when the animatronic shark failed to cooperate and it forced them to show the shark only sparingly on screen, but it's too bad for Earthquake though. Not that there isn't plenty of brutal carnage all throughout the film anyway. Even the disaster sequences are shockingly violent. This is not escapism. This is not just our chance to see buildings get destroyed and all the fun that entails. This is a very violent movie. And a lot of people just straight up die. They don't just run around and largely evade falling debris and things and scream. They get crushed, they jump out of buildings, they get electrocuted, they drown, and on and on and on. Charlton Heston could only do so much. And that's kind of the point. When the big one happens, who's going to be there to save us? Anyone? And is it any surprise that the person that wrote the original script for this movie was none other than Mario Puzo, best known for The Godfather? The true reason this film is the classic it appears to be is that he must have chosen to tell a decidedly dark story about how, in a way, man kind of had this coming too. I think this point has been completely lost both then and even today. Gene Siskel, of Siskel and Ebert fame, wrote a pretty scathing review criticizing the film by how it fails to do what the other disaster films do. Not really sure why critics always do this, but here it is. He wrote, "With a Poseidon adventure, or an airport, the ending is clear. People are saved ultimately through their own or somebody else's enterprise. But with an earthquake, the final solution is out of one's hands. Anyone's hands. Even Allstate's. If the tremors don't stop, then everybody will die. If they do, then only a few people will die. End of story. Gene Siskel, buddy. That's the whole point. His reason for not liking this film is the very reason it's awesome. Now, I'm eternally the optimist, but every now and then I think everyone needs a reminder that there's not always going to be someone there to save the day. You can't criticize a movie for presenting natural disasters the way they actually happen. They are devastating, and lives are actually destroyed. Not every disaster film needs to be a tale of romantic heroism. That's nice, but once in a while we just want to see it all fall apart. Because morally speaking, at this point in our nation's history, that's what happened. It's not like cynicism wasn't also popular. The Poseidon Adventure is pretty damn cynical as well. S.A. Bradley includes the Poseidon Adventure in his discussion of disaster horror largely by pointing out the cynicism, and how in the end, the main clergy character's lack of faith seems to be vindicated by the events of the movie. I'm on the fence about this one. The Poseidon Adventure is much darker than the title would suggest, and some of the deaths are indeed pretty graphic. It is a movie with no real heroes, and a very grim outlook. I could go either way with it though. You know what movie is a no-brainer for me though? The Wave. In case you've missed it, this is a Norwegian disaster film from 2015, and it is one of my all-time favorite disaster movies now.
Vi snakker om en 80 meter høy bølge her. Etter 10 minutter.
Just kidding, I'm not going to play a trailer that's in Norwegian. The Wave is about a geologist that takes a job in Oslo, which means uprooting his family with whom he has very tense relations. But before he goes though, a mountain in one of the fjords they've been monitoring experiences a mass wasting event causing a 160-meter tsunami. The structure and pacing of this movie really is a thing to behold. Often where disaster movies fail is in bad plotting. Either the build-up is slow and boring, or the events are over way too quick, and the rest of the movie feels drawn out. I didn't feel that about this at all. Everything builds organically to a very logical conclusion, and it remains tense even after the disaster occurs. It's expert storytelling, at least in terms of pacing. The most chilling moment is right before the wave arrives. The wave's not seen, but you can hear it. Thousands of people are running up a mountain to get to safety, and it dawns on the main character that many of them are simply not going to make it at all. But as truly terrifying as the wave itself is when it arrives, the aftermath feels nothing short of biblical. Watching the protagonist walk through the destruction feels like something out of Dante's Inferno. And again, there are many moments where the true ugliness of man is on full display. When I watched this movie, I never had a doubt in my mind that I was watching a horror movie. I had seen many people posting this movie in horror groups, which encouraged me to watch it, but I didn't really expect I'd be calling it a horror movie. But, in case you still have doubts, well, Exhibit A, in Why I'm Not Wrong, is Disaster Girls. Imagine my delight when listening to their episode on The Wave when one of them straight up calls this a horror movie in disguise. It's not that I ever actually thought I was crazy, but it's good to know that if I am crazy, I'm not alone. So thank you, Disaster Girls, for making me feel sane. Non-horror fans are actually the ones that will be most likely to disagree, like my parents. Let me tell you about them. The first time I watched The Wave, I was visiting with my folks. My dad's been having health issues the last few years, so whenever I go to visit him, which isn't recently because of coronavirus, unfortunately, we usually sit and watch movies. He also doesn't care what you put in front of him, so I force him to watch horror movies with me because of course I do. But my dad is the kind of movie watcher that likes to pick movies apart. He does it constantly. I showed him Crawl, and he practically broke my heart with what I can only describe as daggers of indifference. It's like he refuses to appreciate the high art of seeing people become alligator food. I just don't get it. Anyways, he picked this movie apart, but only at first. Some way into the film, he must have been enthralled because he didn't have much to say. My mother was more telling, though. She refused to watch it because she doesn't like foreign films. She also refuses to watch horror movies with me, period. Like, not even Tremors, even though she loves Reba McEntire. I thought for sure I could bait her with that one. But I also think this is just for show. My mother is known for popping in and out of a movie while we're watching it, sitting in for scenes here and there before returning to whatever it is she's doing. For The Wave, though, she did this more than usual. It was the actual wave that got her hooked, and she ended up watching the whole movie. By the end, she was bawling her eyes out. And to be fair, so was I. I tell that story because if what I and others are saying is true, there are horror movies out there for everyone. And most importantly, if I can trick my mother into watching a horror movie with me, then I get to cross that off my bucket list. In the interest of time, I'm going to move straight to the second category, and that's man-made disasters. I should qualify what counts here because we are talking about natural horror films after all. Man-made disaster movies without ground rules would be a list a mile long. Take your pick. The entire decade of the 1950s was basically one big red stop sign on man doing just about anything. Most of the non-fantasy creature features could fall into this category, but I already talked about them in episode 3. Still, there are all sorts of science gone wrong type stories we could talk about. One example that comes to mind is Crack in the World from 1965, about some very stupid people that decide to fire a nuclear missile into the Earth to get free energy from magma somehow. This causes a crack in the Earth's crust, which spreads, then circles back to the original spot and effectively carves out a chunk of the Earth that literally flies out into space. It's a very stupid premise, but for its time it was probably pretty shocking. Even aside from being silly and implausible, what I'm interested in here are movies where man has done something that he can no longer control. He has set into motion events that will lead to his doom, and the focus is not so much on making it right, but on watching nature simply take the reins and do her thing. Humans be damned. One such culprit is nuclear radiation, and that remains arguably the biggest and scariest man-made disaster, in film at least. Nuclear technology has come a long way, but that doesn't erase the horrors that have been seared into our psyches. The world got a very shocking dramatization of the greatest ecological disaster in man's history when HBO produced its limited series, Chernobyl.
Chernobyl is on fire. And every atom of uranium is like a bullet, penetrating everything in its path. Metal, concrete, flesh. Now Chernobyl holds over 3 trillion of these bullets. Some of them will not stop firing for 50,000 years.
Tell me how to put it out.
You are dealing with something that has never occurred on this planet before.
This is a series that is straight up horror for the first half and political drama for the second. So much of the horror is psychological though. We have an expert with us the whole time explaining that this black rock in this picture will basically melt your skin and liquefy your insides, so maybe don't touch it. The lengths that everyone is expected to go to deal with this completely exposed reactor core creates a constant sense of dread that doesn't go away until every last bit of the stuff is cleaned up. Maybe that's the point. To say that using nuclear technology is like playing with fire is exactly right. We've been harnessing the power of fire for millennia, and yet fire is still very dangerous. Out-of-control radiation is a lot like a wildfire, and when it burns, there isn't a person watching those red skies of California not thinking about the awesome power of nature at the same time. And that is why, depending on the movie, certain man-made disaster movies, I think, become natural disasters. And there is no better example of this than the film I consider to be the scariest film of all time. It is virtually impossible not to be shook by this movie. And I don't think you can truly call yourself a connoisseur of horror if you haven't seen it. And that's Threads.
When you hear the attack warning, you and your family must take cover at once. The most widespread danger is fallout.
Quite good. Attack warning. Attack warning. Is it for real? Attack warning. It's for bloody real. Is it? You can't just do a face like that. Go get a titty sign or something. Come on, quick, get down.
Threads is, believe it or not, a made-for-TV movie that aired on BBC in 1984, and it tells the harrowing story of what befalls the town of Sheffield after a nuclear bomb is successfully detonated. The film's told in a somewhat docudrama format, being largely a fictional movie, but its scenes are punctuated by a deep voice of God narrator, along with cold statistics that appear on the screen. Often these facts are at total odds with the emotionally heavy events we're actually seeing. As an adult, I've never had the impulse to look away from a horror movie, but there was one moment in this movie where I actually wanted to look away. It's the scene when one of the main characters was walking down the streets of the city after it has basically been flattened by the blast. At first, it seems like nothing you haven't seen 100 times in war movies, but then the movie makes you look closer. And then you see that this is not like most war movies, or any movie you've ever seen. There are bodies laid all about, in various stages of decomposition. Some are burned up so badly they look like charcoal, but they're not as disturbing as the ones that are not yet dead. And that's the way to say it, actually, not yet dead. Everyone you see in this scene, and elsewhere, may as well be dead. The whole sequence feels like a dream. In fact, I realized after watching this movie for what I thought was the first time, that I had seen this movie as a kid. I must have, because there were whole scenes in this movie that I have had nightmares about. I'm not kidding when I say this is one of the most disturbing movies ever made. This movie amps up the psychological horror of nuclear holocaust and plays on your constant fear of what could happen. Half the time it doesn't even need to say it because it knows you're already thinking it. Case in point is a scene where one of the main characters returns to a basement where she left her loved ones. When she left, we saw her go out the basement door, and when she returns, all she has to do is open that same door, and we don't have to go downstairs to know what happened, and neither does she, because we hear the flies buzzing, and we get the idea. Whenever you think that things couldn't get worse, they inevitably do. Radiation sickness can't be treated because there are not enough supplies and there's too much exposure anyway. This also gives way to a cholera outbreak and a government-imposed famine and rioting. As the bodies pile up, the city gets quieter and quieter until the next thing you know, it's back to the Dark Ages. This is not the uplifting tale of heroism that the American version, The Day After, was. It's the most shocking TV event in history, and it's basically one of the high watermarks for what horror as a genre can do. It's one of the most powerful movie experiences, and no, I don't think I'm overselling it. Seeing is believing, so if you don't believe me, then go watch it. Okay, well, on a lighter note, let's talk about infectious disease. This is the third category of disaster movies, and I put it into its own category because the types of stories told are kind of unique to the fact that they are diseases. We're late enough in the year that all the jokes about all the other natural problems are just getting old. You know the ones. Wildfires, hurricanes, now murder hornets. Those would be much bigger stories in a normal year, but now we just kind of treat it like it's the new normal. Just how much more of this can we take? Pandemics and horror are often thought of in the context of zombies, and that's a bit unfortunate if you ask me. Not that I want to knock zombies. I am not one of those lightweight variety horror fans that has zombie burnout, because that is a genre that is constantly reinventing itself. And I say bring it on. But I say it's unfortunate because zombies are not synonymous with pandemics in horror at all. If you caught our Anatomy of Fear episode earlier this year, we talk about this at length. Some of the most interesting pathogen-based horror movies are simply that and nothing else, a horror movie about a highly contagious disease. No accessories, and no zombies. There is an argument to be made that at least some zombie movies ought to be included here, just because it's a virus whose primary side effect is cannibalism and homicidal tendencies shouldn't mean that we count them out, right? Well, I would refer you to what I said back in episode 1 of this series. Is it really based on science, or is it just an excuse to make a movie about one of our favorite movie monsters? Also, is it simply a vehicle for a man versus man conflict that happens to have zombies? Something like The Walking Dead? Or do the zombies represent that always looming bigger bad in the universe? The movie most responsible for our confusion here is probably 28 Days Later. Before that, nobody would have accused a filmmaker that is making a zombie movie of having also made an infectious disease movie. 28 Days Later changed the dynamic of what a zombie could be, and more importantly, what a zombie could mean. Nevertheless, I have to draw the lines somewhere. This is a podcast about natural horror movies after all, and the undead does still kind of seem like one of the most unnatural things we have in horror. Even the films where the zombie is merely infected, but not strictly speaking dead, is still fundamentally like a monster movie. Removing this element from the equation, though, still puts several movies very clearly within the Venn diagram of both infectious disease and natural horror. They can be thought of in two ways. Two periods, really. By now, everyone's probably familiar with the virus known as H1N1. That is the big one, by modern standards. It's not just the basis of the swine flu, but it's the basis of the Spanish flu, which I'm sure everybody by this point now knows took the lives of 50 million people back in 1918. Whenever you have that uneasy feeling that it couldn't get any worse, just remember it always could get worse, because it very much has been worse. The various mutations of influenza virus have kept researchers up at night ever since those dark days 100 years ago. Less known, though, by name at least, is a bacteria named Yersinia pestis. You know that one though, because that's the plague. There are 3 versions of it, the bubonic plague being one of them. These 2 diseases are different in almost every way, but the ones I want to talk about concern how they are depicted in film. They've meant entirely different things historically, and the lessons learned from films depicting these diseases tells us an awful lot about where they fit into our discussion of natural disaster horror. In short, one of these produces natural horror and the other one does not. Let's start with the plague. You may be less familiar with films about this disease, but I assure you there are tons of them. They're not made as much anymore because the plague is not really as widespread as it used to be. Using a biblical word like plague was the closest approximation to an explanation that an understandably terrified people would have had 500 years ago. But I actually think the superstition perspective is leaving something out that we take for granted nowadays. Just because we know better now doesn't mean we're any better morally or intellectually. So let me make an analogy. Imagine that one day you turned on CNN or Fox or whatever news source you fancy these days, and you learned that people are spontaneously combusting in broad daylight. There's no conspiracy, it's not fake news, there's simply video after video. It happens only every so often at first, but as the days go by, more and more people just burst into viscera before your very eyes. No one can explain it, medical experts of all stripes know nothing, the CIA knows nothing. Soon every astrophysicist is trotted out to offer theories about how maybe the solar system might be drifting through some yet unknown kind of space with strange particles, but ultimately they're clueless too. Now tell me, do you think that just because we in 2020 with our advanced gadgets and seasoned wisdom and our time-tested paradigm of scientific enterprise is going to be any comfort to the billions of people that are likely going to be going out of their minds? And if they decide to look for meaning in it all, and in their pursuits decide to entertain divine insight, could you blame them? This is what needs to be taken into consideration with plague fiction. So much of it is a search for understanding. Why is this happening? It's funny that whether the answer is God as it was back then, or nature as it is today, the answer is still the same. It's our fault. There's a moral corruption on our part, and that's what caused this. Of course, having said all of that, you're probably wondering how this may be natural horror if it's probably really just religious horror. Well, actually, that is my point. It isn't. I mean, in a sense, it's a tale of 2 genres. Though both can feature epidemics, they seem preoccupied with different things. This will take a little bit of explaining. So, as an example, consider the German silent horror film The Plague of Florence. This is a good example of what religious horror looked like for a long time. It's based on The Mask of the Red Death, a story that in its own right deserves serious consideration in the context of natural horror. The moral of the original story was man's hubris, which is a very common theme in natural horror for sure. Also in that story, the disease is presented as a sort of natural conclusion to the morally bankrupt elite that feels nature's forces cannot even get at them. The Plague of Florence, on the other hand, somehow makes the common folk just as guilty of the moral failing, if not more so. It's also told in strangely chauvinistic terms, featuring a beautiful woman as the temptress, seducing an entire city into debauchery for most of the movie. And only then, towards the end, does the actual plague arrive, also a woman, and kills everyone. Some films over the years have evolved to tell a more realistic depiction of outbreak, but still struggled to avoid these cliches. Panic in the Streets is a thrilling melodrama from 1950 about a public health expert that tries to convince government leaders to help track down a criminal that is unknowingly carrying the plague. The same year, there was also a movie called The Killer That Stalked New York, with an almost identical plot about a diamond smuggler that is unwittingly spreading smallpox. They decide to vaccinate everyone in New York, which goes pretty well until they run out of the vaccine and the whole city panics. A chase ensues to find the diamond smuggler who started it all, who, if you hadn't guessed it, is a woman. Some of these examples do have the feeling of a disaster film, and whether or not they feel like a horror as well, The Plague of Florence being the best example, they do not present as natural horror. There are films that do, however. For that, we move on to viruses. What I find strange is that while bacteria is organic and naturally occurring, films about bacterially based diseases, as I just explained, tend to lend themselves more to morality plays that often feature religious themes. Viruses, on the other hand, despite being inorganic, do tend to turn our attention towards the uncontrollable character of nature. To really understand the difference between these two types of films, I'm going to cheat a little by talking about what I believe is the first film in the library of pandemic films, and that is the Andromeda strain.
Seems to me, General, Dr. Stone put one over on you. In fact, he made us all think his wildfire lab could handle any contamination from outer space.
Isolate and identify. Good God.
It's no accident. I suspect they were looking for the ultimate biological weapon.
You can change everything.
I say cheat because, as anyone familiar with either the film or the Michael Crichton book on which it's based already knows, the disease in question is extraterrestrial in origin. For that reason, no, I wouldn't call this a natural horror film. It actually feels like it's in the genre of the sci-fi creature feature thriller. But it does have some pretty stellar plotting that later pandemic movies would capitalize on. The film is about a team of scientists that arrive to a town to find people dead from an unknown pathogen that they take to a lab to study. Before their very eyes, they watch as the microorganism mutates until it melts away the rubber and plastic insulation and threatens to escape. And in the end, they would have nuked the place but for the fact that the microorganism dies on its own, apparently unable to sustain life in Earth's environment, much like War of the Worlds. The one thing more than anything else that stands out in natural horror terms is the uncontrollability of the specimen. As with actual pathogens, there's no telling if it will mutate into a form that will be much more deadly. This is actually what happened with coronavirus. Many strains of coronavirus have been around for a long time, but have proven to be less virulent, SARS being one of them. The Andromeda strain presented us with the idea that one day we might be faced with a pathogen that mutates more quickly and spreads faster and more widely than we have any ability to control. Andromeda strain, while not technically a natural horror film, is something of a precursor. It is what the Journal of Clinical Infectious Disease calls the most significant, scientifically accurate, and prototypic of all films in this genre. There's no questioning that Asia has cornered the market on infectious disease horror movies, and that makes sense. The potential for outbreaks are much greater over there in recent decades, and their films kind of reflect that. As far back as 1980, when the Cold War was entering another period of anxiety, the Japanese produced what was at the time the most expensive Japanese movie ever made, a movie called Virus. It's about a team of researchers in Antarctica, about 800 or so, who become among the very few remaining survivors of a supervirus that wipes out nearly all of humanity. Much of the film involves a ridiculous plot to disarm some nukes that are set to go off automatically, but you could say it set the stage for outbreak anxieties. Then there was 1996's Chinese film Ebola Syndrome, about a man that rapes a woman in South Africa and contracts Ebola and then brings it back to Hong Kong with him. There's also the Japanese film Infection about an outbreak of some horrible disease that liquefies one's organs internally, which came out in 2004, just 1 year after the SARS outbreak ended. The best one, though, came from Korea, and that's the 2013 horror film Flu. If you see nothing else in this category, please see this film. This is the film that most resembles a disaster film, more than any other that I've talked about so far. It's about the quarantining of 500,000 people in a Korean district after an extremely deadly strain of the flu breaks out that kills its victims in under 36 hours. It's a very anxious film filled with tension, paranoia, conspiracy, and sheer dread. It's actually a nightmare for anyone who's worried about whether your leaders are going to tell you the truth when the time comes. Isn't that the truth? So many people in the film do exactly what's expected of them, but to disastrous end. And if there's any doubt that this is a horror film, there are a few revelations towards the end of the film that are among the most chilling I've ever seen on film. Korea in particular seems very preoccupied with failures of leadership, which leads to making bad situations worse. This is also true in the creature feature The Host, as well as Train to Busan. Classism has also been explored in these films, as it has been in non-horror Korean films as well, like Snowpiercer and Parasite. And a lot of these things are also true in what I believe is the greatest film in this category, and that's the American film Contagion.
The average person touches their face 3 to 5 times every waking minute. In between, we're touching doorknobs, water fountains, and each other.
Beth. Mom? No, go up to your room, honey.
So we have a virus with no treatment protocol and no vaccine at this time.
You had a seizure this morning, Beth.
Does she have a history of seizures?
No.
Allergies?
As of last night, there are 32 cases.
Is there any way someone could weaponize the bird flu? Is that what we're looking at?
Someone doesn't have to weaponize the bird flu. The birds are doing that.
Watch this. It's transmission, so we just need to know which direction.
On day 1, there were 2 people, and then 4, and then 16. In 3 months, it's 1 billion. That's where we're headed.
They're calling out the National Guard. They're moving the president underground.
People will panic.
Get away!
It will tip over.
The truth is being kept from the world.
Cook your samples, destroy everything.
We talked about this film at length when we did our pandemic episode because it pretty much is the best pandemic movie ever made, in my humble opinion. In fact, it's pretty much the whole reason I wanted to do that episode. When I saw this film in the theater, I had no idea what to expect. I liked Soderbergh as a director, so I recall seeing it for that reason, but I had no idea what I was in for. The experience was shocking. My heart was racing until the last frame of the movie, and I walked out of the theater visibly shaking. This film is nothing short of a nightmare. It's not like Flu, which, despite being about a simple and deadly disease, is a bit silly and over the top at times. There are many moments when it reminds you, unintentionally, that you're just watching a movie. Contagion, on the other hand, offers far less comfort. The first thing to note is how spot on the film ended up being. A lot of people have compared the film to the current pandemic we find ourselves in. These include the origin. They both originated from animals in China. In the film, it jumps from bat to pig and then to human. With coronavirus, it jumped to human from a pangolin, which is the world's most trafficked animal that no one's ever heard of. As with coronavirus, the virus of contagion, known as MEV1, also travels via saliva droplets on hard surfaces known as fomites. The great uncertainty about the disease is also a serious problem in both the movie and the real thing. There are other similarities that are not exactly on the nose, but are certainly comparable. There's Jude Law's character, who's a blogger that deals in conspiracy theory whose persona echoes that of Alex Jones. In the film, he convinces his followers not to take the new vaccine and instead take a homeopathic drug called Forsythia. His claims lead to the pharmacies being overrun and Forsythia supplies being bought up. In a similar vein, claims were made by the president and others that hydroxychloroquine was a valid treatment for coronavirus, even before trials had been concluded. This led to a run on the supplies for that drug, which endangered those that rely on the drug to treat things like arthritis and lupus. Perhaps my favorite parallel, though, had to do with the CDC. In the film, multiple independent labs were working on a vaccine for MEV1, but were told to destroy their samples so that the CDC could produce the vaccine. The rationale in the movie was to prevent the accidental spread of the virus. In reality, a similar thing happened with testing. You probably remember how CDC botched its first round of testing after insisting it create its own test rather than use the ones already being developed by South Korea and Germany. But you probably don't recall to what lengths they went to push for that monopoly. They said that they would not accept any tests from a private lab unless it was FDA approved, and when a researcher from Washington State named Dr. Helen Chu was issued a cease and desist letter from the FDA claiming her lab was not FDA approved, she ran her tests anyway, and her lab ended up producing the first positive case of coronavirus in the United States back in January, and this was prior to the CDC's first round of bad tests. That seemed like forever ago, and it seems so small in comparison to all the chaos that would befall us this year. And boy, has there been a lot of stuff. But I think it's important for this discussion because horror movies capitalize on our worst fears for a reason. We all like to sit back and watch these movies thinking, or rather hoping, that these things we see on screen will never come to pass. We like to think that tens of thousands of people will not perish because of stupid mistakes. I mean, bad people doing bad things in bad faith is one thing, but who would have guessed that bureaucracy could be so deadly? I mean, there are people acting in bad faith in Contagion as well, not just Jude Law's character, but Lawrence Fishburne's character, using his own personal knowledge of the deadly virus to warn his loved ones before everyone else has even told about the outbreak. It doesn't seem so far-fetched. He doesn't even really come across as evil, but rather as someone relatable. I mean, any one of us would have done the same thing. Contagion is great because it's not interested in anyone's political or religious beliefs. Its primary goal is to tell a realistic portrayal of a pandemic. The reason it's terrifying is because we see ourselves in the film so easily, and now we don't even have to guess. The government and the media and everyone else is guilty of most of what we see in this movie, even though we all would have hoped for something better. The film seems to be saying that when it all goes south, we will only have ourselves to blame. The final few shots of the film showing the origin of the virus doesn't really feel like an explanation. It feels more like a coda. Codas are musical structures that are tacked on to the end of complex musical arrangements and often feel like a much simpler version of what you just heard. The film ends with a haunting sequence that reveals how it all started. We see a bulldozer taking down a tree, the natural habitat of some unsuspecting bats, one of which flies into a pig pen, the meat from which is handled by an unsanitary cook that gives it to our heroine. This is a very American ending. It gives us everything we say we want in our movies, an explanation. Tell us what caused this. We must know. On its surface, this could be read as nothing more than a convenient way to trick the viewer into thinking the story is over after its contents have run their course. I mean, not doing so would be quite bleak. Think about what happened right before the sequence. Matt Damon's daughter finally, and I should learn these characters' names. Matt Damon's daughter finally gets to dance with her date, after her very fearful father tells her she cannot be in contact with him until they have both been vaccinated. Had the movie ended right there, that somehow might have been far darker, especially given how many of us are doing that right now with coronavirus. Not being able to socialize the way we used to has certainly had its impact on all of us. So instead of just leaving it there, the film ends with something. I think my first impression was to read it as the cautionary tale it seems to be. Our encroachment into nature caused this, but the more I think about it, the more I'm inclined to think that this ending is actually more psychologically satisfying because it makes sense of it all. It also does one other thing, for our purposes anyway. It reminds us that we just watched a natural horror film and probably didn't realize it. Well, that just leaves one more category worth discussing. As terrifying as all the disasters are in the movies we've discussed so far, I'm looking at you, Threads. There is a particular type of film that goes even further than these. It is a type of disaster film from which there is no promise of survival. It's either depicted or implied that no one at all is going to make it out alive. And this frees the film to go even deeper. And this is the Doomsday film. This is another category of film that obviously includes many movies that are not natural horror films. Films like This Is the End and, technically speaking, Cabin in the Woods. Sorry for the spoiler. It's a wide-ranging genre that is popular as non-horror as well, with everything from Dr. Strangelove to Seeking a Friend for the End of the World. In case it's not clear already, I'm not talking about post-apocalyptic movies where life goes on in some horrible new dystopia. And I'm not talking about movies in which some calamity befalls man, but he ultimately survives, if barely. No, I'm talking about movies where it all ends. The whole thing. These are movies less about survival and more about reckoning with one's death most directly. For those that still have issues to work out, this can be pretty scary. Admittedly, there aren't very many of these films that I would consider to be truly both natural and horror, but there are two that stand out. They are truly terrifying films that present the end of the world with all the dread that it warrants. They honestly and accurately portray the pitiful range of human emotion given the horrible circumstances of total oblivion. The first film to talk about here is probably the best known, and that's Lars von Trier's Melancholia.
What star is that? The red one?
I don't know.
What's going on, Justine?
It's a planet that has been hiding behind the sun. Now it passes.
I'm afraid of that stupid planet.
And it is not going to hit us.
You promise? Life is only on Earth. And not for long. I don't think you know that at all. Sometimes I hate you so much.
It is about a planet that is set to collide with Earth, and the lives of two sisters that deal with it in different ways. It isn't known until about halfway through the film that the rogue planet that flies by Earth is on a trajectory to return and smash into the planet, but in the meantime, a lot of drama occurs between these two sisters, played by Kirsten Dunst and Charlotte Gainsbourg. In fact, it might have been supposed that the planet colliding in the beginning of the film really was meant to be just a metaphor. The beautiful and horrifying collision is slowed down, giving us beautiful shots of electric lightning bolts, all to the tune of music that fully sets the tone fitting of the film's title. For nearly an hour, we could have guessed that this was merely symbolic. If it was a metaphor for how the first sister is handling her depression in the midst of a wedding, which is supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life, it would still have been a great film. But then the focus shifts to the other sister, and we quickly see how fragile her worldview is compared to the first sister. She's more like the rest of us, the ones that cannot possibly know what depression feels like. Well, she gets a crash course when she learns that it's all about to end. I don't want to give too much away, but how their father handles things is also telling as well. This is a film that works on so many levels. Most importantly, it works on the literal level as well. For so many of us, not having really confronted the fear of one's own death is one of the most universal fears there is. For so many of us, not having really confronted the fear of one's own death is one of the most universal fears there is. It is the basis of so much horror, and explains the ongoing popularity of the genre. Melancholia is infused with so much dread, which makes it so great, but it feels very different depending on which character we're focused on. It probably feels different depending on who's watching the movie too. Interesting side note. I saw this film in the theater with my then girlfriend who, unbeknownst to me at the time, had become accustomed throughout her life to regularly taking antidepressants. She hated this film. She said it was one of the most upsetting movies she'd ever seen in her life. So, if you ever want some advice on picking the worst movies for date night, I'm your guy. There is another movie that depicts an end-of-the-world scenario that is truly horrifying, but it's less steeped in metaphor and more indicative of common human psychology and behavior. The characters of this movie truly span the entire spectrum of human desire, and it builds to a remarkably satisfying conclusion that, like Melancholia, is bound to leave a lasting impression on you. I'm talking about the Australian disaster film These Final Hours.
Is there anybody out there? It's happened. Approximate location of impact, the North Atlantic. As I speak to you right now,
It's making its way towards our fair nation.
We have 12 hours, people.
We're already dead. It's gonna hurt. And I don't want to feel it. I don't want to feel a thing.
If you haven't seen this one, it really is a hidden gem. In this film, an asteroid successfully makes impact with Earth in the northern Atlantic, creating a global firestorm that eventually travels all the way across the entire globe until it reaches the west coast of Australia. The inhabitants have exactly 12 hours before the blaze arrives, and life in these hours is quite grim. The main character leaves the woman he's having an affair with to go find his girlfriend at a huge party. Along the way, he meets a little girl that helps him realize that his original goal of getting so high that he feels nothing is maybe not the best decision. I won't say anything else about the story though, because it really is quite unexpectedly character-driven for a disaster movie, and this movie flies by in the blink of an eye. Regarding its bleak premise, this film truly commits. The people in this film do truly behave as though there is no tomorrow, many acting with reckless abandon. Others simply take their own lives quietly, but this includes families with small children. As we see everything that each character chooses, it really does up the stakes for the main character, who clearly doesn't know what he wants. The firestorm is coming no matter what, and as his lover says at the beginning of the film, how one chooses to live is more important than how we die. I honestly can't think of many films that make us confront death in all its feared complexity as this film, so I say check it out. With that, I think we're done. I was a bit surprised to find that of all the episodes in this series, this would probably be the longest, but I just couldn't help diving into this all the way. As you can see, disaster horror is a very diverse subgenre, and I still have the sense that we haven't even seen anything yet. I hope you're enjoying these videos. I am at least on pace to finish the next 2 episodes, but I may not have time for the 7th. If I do, I may put that one out in December because I do have most of it worked out. As always, I want to know what you guys think about this genre. You can email us at anatomyoffearpodcast@gmail.com or visit our website, anatomyoffear.com, where I have a short but diverse enough list of natural horror films in case you want to get some recommendations and follow along with this. We're pretty active on Facebook if you want to like us there, and Brandon and I also have accounts on Letterboxd. If you want to follow us on there, we do post reviews pretty regularly. I do have a couple lists going over there for natural horror, so feel free to follow us there. If you watch any natural horror movies this month, use the hashtag NaturalHorrorNovember and let us know. I'll be back in a few days with episode 5, so stay tuned. Be safe.